Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new episode. Today, we're here with Dr. Colleen Crowley. Dr. Colleen has been traveling the world for over 30 years and has explored dozens of countries as a solo female traveler. So, Dr. Colleen, thank you so much for being here with us. And to start off the interview, can you share with us your experience with solo travel and how it has transformed your relationship with yourself and with others?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Lou, for having me. It's one of my all-time favorite topics ever to discuss. So it's thrilling to be here. And yes, of course. So solo traveling for me as a female has sort of gone on for, close to 3 decades at this point. So following my undergrad experience in California, I knew that I wanted to travel the world. So I actually went to the travel agency on my campus and I bought an around the world trip ticket. And you'd be shocked to hear the price. I still tell people it was $3,000. And I had unlimited sort of opportunity to travel to as many countries as I wanted to. So I set off with a backpack and very sort of little absolutely no experience traveling the world. I had not sort of been international at that point. Certainly, none traveling solo. It was just something I wanted to do. I felt sort of a calling. And you have to sort of imagine this is before we had cell phones, or even I had to find, there were a couple internet cafes just starting to pop up because this is the early 90s. So it was quite the adventure. I went to over 25 countries, camping, hosteling, staying in hotels, meeting, lifelong friends and developing relationships. And truly it was completely and utterly transformative. I think from there, then the last couple decades, I went into psychology as a field. So I've been a practicing psychologist for over 20 years. And I think that it was those travels that were foundational to me as a person, me as a clinician, and I continue to travel solo for the last 2 decades. I'm also a mom of three. So I have two teenage girls and a 9-year-old son. And I'm now watching them begin their solo travels, which is an entirely different and powerful experience. And then additionally, just last year, my husband and I and three kids and big dog decided that we wanted to be permanently nomadic, and we both work remotely, both of us. And so we're traveling full time with using Spain as our home base, moving from California to Spain last year. So it's kind of been a lifelong pursuit of mine. I'm working with a lot of families now looking to move and travel themselves, as well as a lot of female travelers as well. And I think, what I would say is I'm not even sure it transformed me. I think traveling as a solo female has completely shaped me. It's been utterly and completely foundational to how I see the world. Yeah, how I parent, how I've done therapy, philosophically. It's been, arguably one of the more sort of most influential sort of aspects of my life.
Do you mind if we go more in detail about that concept, how it shaped you? So what are like some, and you said that it has heavily influenced you, but in which ways? What do you think is different after all those years of travel?
Right. Um, Gosh. So the first thing that comes to mind is, 30 years ago, when I put on a backpack and set out to sort of travel the world, I was really sort of passionate about going into obstetrics and women's health. And after traveling, I realized that the world as a whole, and people especially, were so fascinating, and how different we were, but I think more importantly, how similar we all are. And I knew that I wanted to go in the direction of psychology. So following those world travels is when I started my master's and then my PhD in psychology, really just trying to understand the human condition, and philosophically and existentially sort of realizing, like I said, that I think times were polarizing then. I think in many ways they've only become increasingly polarizing. I happen to believe that the healing for all of us individually and collectively comes through understanding that we all belong to one another, that we're connected in more ways than one. And so I think for me, that's sort of at the core of how it has shaped me so profoundly in a way that I don't think if I hadn't have traveled, I would have really understood that and the
Yeah.
essence of that. And that's shaped, like I said, how I go through life, how I do therapy, how I see others, how I parent my children, and so on.
Got it. When I hear you saying that, something that came to mind in my personal experience has been how solo travel has developed my level of empathy. Now that I have been to so many countries, especially on my own, I have made deep connections with people in other cultures, people from different ages and different genders as well. So it really comes down to realize that, yeah, we deep down at the core, we all have the same needs and wants.
Right.
It's just we have maybe a few things that separate us, like culture is a big one, language, but
Sure.
at the core, we all want the same things. We all want to be loved, we all want to belong. So to me, that has been also a game changer and has shaped me in a way where I also try to see what's beyond the things that separate us.
That's right. Or just sort of the surface level stuff we get stuck on. And that's also something that's been sort of profound in terms of being a psychologist for quarter of a century is I always tell people, I don't think there's been someone I've sat with that I haven't loved. And what I mean by that is when you are intimately connecting with someone and their vulnerabilities and their stories, it's impossible, right? If you're connected to your own humanity, to not understand sort of at the core the suffering or the process for them, regardless of sort of the superficial. So I think, and travel is the same way, right? I mean, you get set down somewhere sort of radically, so you think different than what you were exposed to or what your experience was, and you realize if you have an open mind and an open heart, just how similar we all are. And I think another thing that really comes out of all of it for me too, which is a really big tenet in therapy, is, obviously I'm a big proponent of therapy. And I think doing introspection and self-examination is, first of all, it's a luxury, but if you're able to, it's a tremendous sort of opportunity. And at the same time, I can only speak to sort of American culture, because that's where I practice predominantly, although I have clients all over the world, is it can also get a little bit sort of myopic and a little bit sort of narrow. And there can be sort of too much sort of self examination, right? Which is why, having traveled the world, when I'm working with people, oftentimes there's a powerful instinct that, what would really be sort of transformative for you is to get out of here, right? To go understand how big the world is, how insignificant we all are, and yet incredibly important, right? In terms of a piece of the puzzle. And so I think that that's another incredibly sort of powerful part of traveling.
Yeah, for sure. Something I really encourage my listeners to do is to reflect on their trips, and also to do some journaling while they're traveling as well,
Yes.
because there are so many thoughts that go through your mind when you are in all these different environments and you start questioning so many things. So the best way to reflect through it and to think through it is to write it down, because you need to also take all those thoughts out of your head.
You do, right. And also sometimes you don't even have those thoughts until you're finally alone in a foreign country, right? Which is why, another reason sort of traveling as a solo female allows you, I think, we underestimate how burdened, even if we have healthy relationships, how burdened we are by expectations of our family, of our culture, of what it means to be a woman, regardless of where you are, right? And where you've been raised. And when you go somewhere and you're anonymous and you're freed of that for a moment, you start to hear parts of yourself that have never been sort of allowed to percolate up. Right. And so I love this idea of this is when you should journal and this is when you can, hear parts of yourself, and commune with that intuition that maybe perhaps was never allowed to percolate up otherwise.
Yeah. Now that you mentioned that, Dr. Colleen, something that I get asked a lot is intuition. Like, what's intuition really mean, and how can we connect to that? So, can you tell us about this?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think some people get sort of spooked by the word sort of intuition and sort of thinking that it's sort of like a woo-woo term. And the truth is that intuition is as sort of old as time. I mean, it's essentially connecting to your own wisdom, right? Your own calling. There is a profound sort of importance of developing a mind-body relationship. So much of the time in Western culture, especially, there is a disconnect. We live in our heads, everything's analytical. And while that's absolutely invaluable and important, there's also a relationship and a dynamic. And I think listening to sort of a deeper wisdom, and an intuition, I mean, honestly, is game changing. And probably where I spend a tremendous amount of time with people, having worked with them for this long, in helping them connect to that. And I think it's just, you can call it a lot of things, right? It's getting radically present, right? It's getting grounded. It's interesting because in a lot of sort of, native cultures, sort of, they used to do vision quests, right? Or walkabouts, I think in Australia is what they call them, where they would send primarily men and oftentimes adolescents out into the wild for long stretches of time to sort of get in touch with they called it a lot of things, spirits or their guides, or their intuition. I think everybody can relate to it regardless of what culture you grew up in. But we don't get the chance in today's current culture to do it a lot. We're not encouraged to do it as children. We're bombarded constantly, with stimulation. And so just getting quiet and connecting to yourself is sort of the most sort of distilled statement I could say about intuition. Traveling alone allows it to percolate up, in my experience, in the most powerful way.
Got it. I know, especially when I'm traveling alone, I really pay attention to what my body's telling me.
Yes.
If I go into a room and just the energy feels heavy, or I just don't like it, I leave right away because my body's telling me something that my mind doesn't want to see.
That's right.
And also, since I moved to the United States, I kind of like fell on the productivity trap, and I was always trying to do something, and doesn't matter if I'm tired, I gotta be disciplined. And I remember last year, I felt completely burnt out, but I just kept going, and I just got sick. I even got my wisdom teeth at 30, which something that had never happened.
Amazing. Yeah.
And it was just my body being like, okay, you have to stop. But my mind was like, no, productivity. We got to keep going. I have some goals to meet. And then I completely shut down.
And what an invaluable lesson, right? You've developed. And to be clear, I mean, we all have that work to do, right? This sort of buzzword right now of sort of mindfulness or mind-body connection. It's in no way sort of, supposed to sort of dilute how powerful it is. Our body never lies.
Yes.
Right. It's our mind that tricks us the most. However, we have an over-reliance sort of on our mind. Traveling sort of neurologically, and I want to say maybe you had someone on here who even talked about this on your podcast, but things happen to us neurologically, right? Where our memories are more powerful, our senses are heightened when we travel. And that's why most people sort of express sort of incredible passion and positivity following travel is because I think it actually radically brings you into the present moment, right? Which allows you to connect to your intuition, which allows your senses to come alive. And we just don't get it enough. And so, yes, we have to be able to incorporate it into our everyday. And also, if there's opportunity to travel by yourself, and that doesn't mean the whole time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You can go as a couple, you can go as a family, you can go with friends, but to also find those moments, those times, those experiences to find your quiet and your alone time.
Exactly. Extremely important. So now also, Dr. Colleen, I want to ask you about connections, right? So like, how does the absence of familiar social networks and also support systems during solo travel can push us to interact with strangers and build new connections?
Mm-hmm. Wow. I mean, it's such a great topic. I think, again, sort of going back to this notion that, we're very much a product of where we've been raised, where we grew up, who our family was, what schools we went to, where we work, what neighborhood we live in. And regardless of how hard you try to stay open minded, right, you're still sort of limited by circumstances and your thinking gets narrow. And so you end up interacting with who you maybe think you're supposed to or who you're exposed to. When you travel, right, you end up having so much of that set aside and you're sort of meeting a fresh population without being encumbered by all of those expectations. And I'm sure this has been your experience and most of the people who you travel, you end up making some of the most incredible connections of your life, right? And I think sometimes it's because it's such an authentic connection. We're free of much of that and able to connect to people in a way where we're not sort of burdened by who or what or a narrow perspective.
For sure, yeah, I can totally say that one of my best like lifelong friendships came from travel,
Right.
and it was so at the moment I met with this person in a different country while traveling, the connection was so authentic because, for
Yeah.
example, something I have noticed here in the United States is that when someone meets you, the first question is, and what do you do?
What do you do? Yeah. Right.
Yes.
Yes. And I think what's also interesting is solo travel or travel in general can be somewhat self-selecting because you're also likely meeting people who also want to connect with other people, have a sense of adventure, and that in it of itself sort of allows for, a chemistry that's quite powerful.
Exactly. And also, I wanted to follow up with this question when we were talking about intuition, because also our intuition, when we're connected to it and we meet someone new, right away our body tells us, like, do I feel comfortable with this person or not? And
Right.
again, we don't have any agenda. We don't have to follow any rules. And we can just be like,
Yep.
okay, if I don't feel comfortable, I just leave.
Yeah, right. And especially with women, right? Because the reality is that there's inherently more risk. And so all the more reason our intuition has to be sort of turned up high when we are traveling, when we're without our sort of familiar sort of surroundings and securities and people. And so connecting with that intuition, whether it's good or bad, to say, like, this is a safe person. Wow, there's incredible chemistry here. Or this isn't entirely safe. Let me pivot and get
Yeah.
myself in a position where I feel more comfortable. Absolutely.
Yes, 100%. And Dr. Colleen, now I want to ask you about your daughters, right? So
Yes.
you
Okay.
have two teenage daughters
Yes.
and you have been traveling with them, and now you guys are living in a different country. So what have you seen that your daughters do differently than someone that has never traveled before, let alone a teenager, a female teenager? So I want to ask you about this because the teenage years are a lot.
They are. Yes. So I think wow, it's been even more than I think I expected, to be honest.
Okay.
With observing my children sort of live internationally. So, and to be clear, we've traveled extensively. Travel is different than sort of living sort of for a longer stretch somewhere. So, it has been totally and completely sort of explosive in terms of mind expansion, I think, for all of them. Teenagers, to be clear, are supposed to be sort of narrow. And by definition, around the globe, they can be self centered, right? And that's a developmentally appropriate sort of thing at times, right? What sort of living where we are right now, so we're in Spain, but we're traveling all over the world, is it has been radical to sort of see their global perspective change in so many ways. And, to watch their language acquisition has been fascinating because ours as adults just is not that quick. So that's been incredible. They have made, one of my favorite parts is they have made friends all over the world. And they also have no desire to go back to the United States. And what's really interesting is we didn't necessarily move because, there's plenty of criticism of sort of every country has their pros and cons. Mm-hmm. And there's certainly frustrations or disappointments about where we are from. But we weren't one of those that were like, we have to get out because this is catastrophic. What is interesting, however, is being here, it does make you sort of see your own culture in a really powerful way. I mean, we're all ethnocentric, right? You can only pick up so much, even if you read or travel or expose yourself, until you sort of live somewhere intimately and get to know people and you know something about this. Do you really start to understand how limited your worldview is?
Yes.
So that's been amazing. I think, 2 nights ago, I sat on my daughter's bed and helped her pack. And she just set off on a big solo backpacking experience. She just turned 17. So I'm beyond excited for her. Obviously, it brings up a level of apprehension. It's one thing if I'm supporting women that I care and love about. When it's your own 16, just turned 17-year-old daughter, there's apprehension, there's excitement. And it's kind of this process of empowering them as much as you can and educating them as much as you can. And then also letting them go have their life experiences. I only became a good world traveler because I did it on my own. And so it's been incredible to see them and to now be setting off on their journeys is powerful.
Wow, that is amazing. And I wanted to ask you that because I know that during our teenage years, you were very egocentric. It's only about ourselves. And I just can't imagine how it would be for a teenage girl that has been exposed to different cultures, to different languages, has been living in a different country for many different reasons, and
Right.
and I wish everyone could have some of that.
Me too. Yes, I know most people think, how were you able to pull a 14 and a 16-year-old away, right? Because it's all about friends then. And we were so lucky because they were really up for the experience. And that's not to say that it's been, without sort of missing of some friends and that's also okay, right? I mean, I think, and this sort of leads into another, I think, really valuable topic that I talk to, women especially about is when you travel alone, it's deeply uncomfortable at times, right? And you also, this idea of resilience that you get from traveling. One thing that comes up a lot in sort of doing therapy with people for so long, and what's sort of born out of Western cultures is a real resistance to discomfort. And, where a lot of people that are medicated, there's a lot of sort of talk about which has its sort of purposes. There's a lot of talk of sort of avoiding discomfort, of not having any sort of fluctuation in mood or in life circumstances. And the truth is that life is very complicated, right? And there's a lot to feel. And I think that one of the things that I feel incredibly passionate about is helping people understand that that actually makes life worth living, right? It's our resistance to that feeling or that discomfort that is the biggest challenge. But once I start sort of helping people understand, like, wait a second, actually, it's a good thing to feel a variation in emotions and feelings in good times, in bad times. And also, you get through it, and on the other side of that, you have a confidence about your capacity to deal with adversity and challenges. I think travel really allows that to develop in people, and in women. I mean, when you land somewhere and you don't know anyone and don't speak the language and don't know where you're going to stay, and you're out of everything, familiar and comfortable, and you have to sort of construct a life or a reality, and you have to tolerate being lonely, possibly a little fearful, tolerate the unknowns. But you get to the other side of that. Not only has it been, in most cases, completely transformative and amazing, but now you have the sense of like, oh, I can do hard things. I can do hard things. And I think that needs to be cultivated, in people more. So I think travel allows for that.
For sure. I mean, you are in constant problem solving. Again,
Yes.
there's nothing familiar around you. Talking about cultures, there's something that I really take from Latin cultures, that we are very resilient,
Yes.
but to a point where we don't make any demands, which is not good either. But
Interesting, right?
yes.
And I imagine living in a different culture perhaps illuminated that even more for you.
For sure. I just noticed that, for example, some people in my life that get very aggravated by some things where I will be like, okay, no, I actually sit down with them. I'm like, you know
Yeah.
what? I think that there are some
Yeah.
things that you can do. But again, and not saying this in the sense that I'm better or worse. No, it's just
No.
that growing up in a culture where you have to do so many things to go ahead,
Yes.
because you don't really have much control of your environment, so to say.
Right.
Like, for example, I was in Mexico last year in October, and I was aware again of that problem solving, that resilience, that I remember there was a
Yeah.
taxi that just stopped in a big
Yeah.
intersection, and then just a bunch of guys
Mhm.
got out of their cars and helped push the taxi, stuff
Right.
like that.
Absolutely. No,
Yes.
and I mean, again, it's funny because you and I had a private conversation about a gestalt, right? Which is what you
Yes.
gravitate towards. And what that means is sort of, taking a little bit from everything to create a whole,
Mm-hmm.
that is perspective lending and powerful and layered. And I think that is, again, one of the most valuable things that comes out of travel. Is it's not about looking, and most travelers, that's not the experience they have. It's not, oh, look how great my culture is. It's like, oh, let
Yeah.
me take all these really wonderful parts from
Yes.
different cultures and create sort of a something that's better than it was before.
Exactly.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think that's where the power of reflection also comes in, because one thing is visiting a place, but then another one is also like really traveling through that place, and
Yeah.
observing those dynamics and
Yes.
interacting with people, and ask about why they do what they do.
Right.
It's a game changer.
It is. It's so illuminating and enriches us as humans. And it's one of the greatest things about that comes out of traveling. There's no question.
For sure. So, Dr. Collins, we were talking about your daughter, right? So, I want to ask you if you can share some practical tips or
Mm.
advice for someone considering embarking on their first solo travel adventure, and
Yes.
wants to use this adventure as a way to, personal growth, and also to develop a stronger relationship with themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great question. And I'm sure this is your experience too. Almost everyone you talk to has some sort of desire to travel by themselves, or recently, because we moved abroad, every single person you talk to sort of, I think it sort of taps into sort of some sort of fundamental human DNA to sort of explore and have adventures. But I always tell people that you don't have to start big, right? So the goal of traveling alone in so many ways is to get quiet, right? To find yourself connecting to that intuition and to that wisdom, and to observe the world around you and yourself in a way that you haven't before. If you're limited by family or funds, even something as simple as sort of going on a hike by yourself, right? Or something out of the ordinary to begin just kind of getting and developing those muscles of sort of being alone. Um, it's not to sort of, buy a ticket for 6 months and park yourself somewhere extreme and radical. Although I've known lots of women and people who've done that, and that's okay if you feel ready for that. But I think it's to start small. I work with lots of moms who have a really hard time getting away and finding alone time at all, let alone 5 minutes. Even something like a night away to a place you've never been, getting out in nature, communing with yourself is incredibly important. So start small, follow your instincts, read other people's experiences. There's such an incredible network of other travelers, female travelers, family travelers, where you can start to get ideas and feel inspired. And I think the other thing you and I touched on a little bit is, being a solo female traveler does not mean you have to be a solo female, right? So I've been with the same partner for over 25 years. He just left for 4 days to go surf by himself on the coast. My oldest child's hiking by herself. So you can be part of a family and part of a relationship. But I do a lot of couples therapy, and I'm a huge fan of saying, plan separate trips. Go by yourself. And it doesn't have to be entirely by yourself. I just worked with a woman and she planned a trip to Patagonia with a group of other women, but she made a point of having on either end of her trip nights alone. So it's not all or nothing. There's no sort of one formula or one way to do it.
Got it.
Start small, right? And just experiment with it.
So I'm really glad that you mentioned those points that, start small. You don't have to go buy a ticket for 6 months and I don't know, go to Bali or go to Malaysia.
Yes, right.
You can just take a small getaway during the
Yes.
weekend or a hike, and also the importance of that you can be part of a group, a network, but then also have your own time.
Absolutely. Yes. So I just supported a woman yesterday, and she's leaving for 2 months to travel. And it's kind of a vision quest for her. It's a big sort of soul searching experience. But she also doesn't want to be completely alone and, wants to meet other people. And so we sort of constructed this sort of really amazing itinerary of doing sort of digital nomad hostels for entrepreneurs, right? But also spending time alone. And it can be both things.
Wow. No, definitely a trip you can customize into whatever your needs are. Yes.
Yep.
And we have so many options nowadays. So now, Dr. Colleen, I want to ask you, this is going to be my last question for this interview, but how can we carry all these lessons that we learn from solo travel into our everyday lives? And also maintain a positive relationship with ourselves and others? I'm saying this because coming back from a trip is really hard. And I remember I have found myself depressed for like a few months because I had all these life-changing experiences when I was traveling, but then I come back home and okay, now I have to work. I have to do all the things that I used to do before. So can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, I know you can probably relate to this as someone who's sort of part of a nomadic and traveling community and expat community. It's sort of a joke to always have a trip on the books, right? To always have something. And again, even if it's small, and there doesn't have to be sort of money associated with it, right? I think that that's probably an entirely different podcast, is sort of, is how to have really rich, valuable experiences if it's compromised with time or funds. But I think trying to have something to look forward to is important. I think, look, if we wanted to sort of drill down on this, I think if you're constantly sort of feeling like you're not where you want to be following travel, I think that ties back to the just following your intuition and seeing, is there some pivoting that needs to happen, right? Is
Yes.
what can I do to, and again, I mean, life is not always sort of rainbows and butterflies.
Mhm.
And also, if there's too much frustration or unhappiness chronically, that's definitely something to pay attention to say, how do I tweak this? How do I sort of change my environment so that it doesn't feel frustrating or stale? Um, and and then with the first question, I think is how do you continually sort of incorporate the lessons from your travels? Is, I mean, the good news is I think if you do them, if you travel solo, they're in you sort of for life, right? Which is, I just did that, right? I just backpacked there by myself or navigated that experience. And now when I go up against something difficult, I have that sort of in my cells, and that confidence sort of just builds through practically doing it. But I think the other sort of most valuable thing is travel causes you to be radically present in so many ways. So you're not living in the future, which is anxiety producing, and you're not living in the past, which often sort of conjures up a lot of depression. And so, much of what happens in therapy is really trying to help people live in the present moment.
Mm.
It's sort of one of the most sort of effective tools for mitigating much of what ails us, spiritually and psychologically. Travel is always something that I can go to with people to say, when was the last time you remember being really present, right? And so often it's travel for people, right? Oh, when I was hiking here or swimming in the ocean there. And so what I do is I use that as a template for them to connect to what was going on in that moment for you,
Mm.
right? So undoubtedly you were in your body, your senses were heightened. You weren't thinking about next week, right? Or next year. You were being sort of lit up by all your senses in that given moment. And that's a really, really powerful template for then to sort of use as a portal into getting yourself connected.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I just go back to that moment where you felt really present and using that as a template for. Sorry, that definitely blew my mind. And as you started talking about it, I was like, when was that moment? Which was recently, of course.
Yes.
But I
Yeah.
was like, oh yes, like just experiencing those feelings that you had when you were present, which usually are very, very pleasant.
Right. Isn't it interesting? I mean, and as absurd as it sounds, we in theory should be like that as much as possible, right? We're sitting here, you know, in the same environment we're in on a regular basis, and yet we're supposed to be, or the work is to be lit up by sort of the miraculousness of it
Yes,
as
yes.
much as possible, right? So it's a muscle that we have to work, but there is sort of probably um, the sort of biggest take home of how to incorporate that on a continual basis.
100%. And also,
Yeah.
when you were mentioning about that, if we feel this resistance when we're coming back from a trip, maybe there's a shift that we need to make.
Yeah,
And yeah, and
absolutely. Yeah, and to listen to that, right? And to not
yes,
judge it and to not feel panicked about it, but just notice it, sort of what's percolating up, and maybe it doesn't mean right now. That's one thing I help with people a lot is saying, okay, so the path right now hasn't illuminated itself, but there's something sort of percolating up in you. There's something you took home from your travels. There's something that shifted. Let's just notice right now,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, it's crazy how we get so caught up into this complicated thing that, oh, I need to do this, I need to do that. But at the end of the day, it just comes down to checking with yourself and to listen to your body and find actually those quiet times to listen to yourself. And if there is a change to be made, do it. I remember when I used to have these episodes where I was very sad coming after the trip was when I was living in California. But now that I live in Chicago, I have, relationships that really matter to me, and I feel really comfortable at my house. I look forward coming back home.
So that's so great, right? And then it can ultimately shift too, right?
Yes.
And that's life. As we were talking, there's chapters. I know we're wrapping up, but I think just recently, we always knew we wanted to sort of travel indefinitely with our children and live in a different culture. But it was really hard with 3 kids in different sort of places developmentally. But there was a kind of a growing sort of restlessness in all of us, right? That hadn't been there even a year or 2 prior. That was like, okay, so this has been lovely. And now it's not quite as lovely, right? We're sort of noticing things developmentally in everyone that needed some shifting, and then who knows what's next, right?
Exactly.
You take it as it comes.
Exactly, and always checking in with yourself and see if this feels like the right move.
Yes, in a world that's really working to try to get you to not, right? That's the work. So
that's true. It's sometimes it takes a lot of energy to go against the current, but it's totally worth it.
It absolutely is, for sure.
So, Dr. Colleen, thank you so much for everything you shared with us. And if anyone listening to this episode wants to get in contact with you, where can they find you?
Absolutely. So I have a website. It's Dr. Colleen T. Crowley. But also we have a website. It's International Family Life, which is we're sort of documenting our nomadic adventures also. So either one.
Got it. Perfect. So I will make sure to leave the links to your websites and your social media in the show notes. And again, thank you so much. Everything you shared with us was amazing.
It was delightful. Thanks for having me.